While driving across the country from DC to the North Cascades of Washington State, where I would be a wilderness ranger and fire lookout in the summer of 2020, I stopped at a record store in St. Louis. There I found a Timothy Leary record stuffed with newspaper clippings from the 60s Haight-Ashbury psychedelic scene. I was instantly transported to my 15-year-old body when I first stepped into the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco and knew with certainty that I had been born in the wrong generation. Even decades after the 1967 Summer of Love, the neighborhood largely retains its vibrant soul. Creatives, hippies, punks, hitchhikers, buskers, anarcho-communists, and freight hoppers all mingle in the bright California sun. How did San Francisco become the site for the Summer of Love? There were a number of factors, but I would argue that the influence of the Beat Generation writers, combined with inspiration by the vast nature of the American West, instigated the West Coast psychedelic movement. Who were the Beat Generation? They were a group of countercultural writers who came out of post-World War II America, rejecting the conformist mainstream and questioning the materialist values of the 50s. They sought out crazy experiences and aimed to live life to the fullest, experimenting with psychedelics and exploring Eastern religions and sexuality. They were radical individuals, bohemians, anarchists, literary nonconformists, adventurers, jazz lovers, Buddhists, poets, and scholars of nature who were curious to explore both the vast wilderness of America as well as the wilderness within themselves. How did the Beats influence the start of the hippie movement? As their writings gained prominence, they were able to widely share their alternative ideologies and values. They excited a new generation of young people who developed both a hatred for the man and a curiosity towards nature. However, the Beats had to start somewhere. They first coalesced in New York City around Columbia University in 1944. After spending time in the Greenwich Village bohemian art scene, many of the Beats moved to San Francisco in the mid-50s, excited by the promise of unbridled creativity, freedom of expression, and boundless nature. They couldn't have arrived at a more perfect time. The city was bubbling up with many creative and collaborative energies, ripe for the San Francisco Renaissance. Artist-oriented establishments such as the Sixth Gallery and City Lights bookstore held weekly salons for local poets and bohemians to share their poetry and art with one another. It was at the Sixth Gallery reading in 1955 that Allen Ginsberg, the central figure of the Beats, introduced his revolutionary poem, Howl. Ginsberg originally hailed from New Jersey and was Jewish, communist, and openly queer. He wrote radical political poetry, advocated for psychedelic liberation, and socialized freely in San Francisco. He was able to bring together all of his circles, and he knew everyone, from the Beatles to Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead. Another prominent Beat who shared poetry at the same Sixth Gallery reading was Gary Snyder. The most distinctly West Coast Beat, he was a product of Pacific Northwest logging culture with a deep interest in wilderness exploration, Zen Buddhism, and meditation. He studied many Oriental languages as well as the cultural anthropology of the Northwest indigenous peoples. He found solace in the wilderness and advocated for a simple nature connected life through his writings, rightfully gaining his name as the Thoreau of the Beat generation. Another central Beat and friend of both Ginsberg and Snyder was Jack Kerouac, who hailed from Massachusetts. He had a unique, spontaneous prose writing style and wrote On the Road about his experience hitchhiking and traveling around the vast American landscape. Kerouac deeply revered Gary Snyder, who introduced him to the freedom of nature-based ways of living on the West Coast, the topic at hand in Kerouac's novel, The Dharma Bums. He writes of Snyder, "He doesn't need any money. All he needs is his rucksack with those little plastic bags of dried food and a good pair of shoes, and off he goes and enjoys the privileges of a millionaire in surroundings like this." Kerouac is inspired by his lifestyle as Snyder takes him to climb Yosemite's Matterhorn Mountain and later invites him to a cabin on his friend's property. Describing Snyder's impact, Beat Michael McClure said, "Just look at Kerouac. He didn't go back on Route 66, hugging Neil Cassidy and weeping big sad tears. He climbed a mountain." Kerouac would follow Snyder's footsteps and become a fire lookout in the North Cascades of Washington in 1956. Kerouac and Snyder's writings about answering the call of the great American wilderness represented a quintessentially Beat ideal: the freeing encounter of man and vast unknown natural expanse. This encounter with unknown wilderness parallels the psychedelic experience exactly. We can encounter the unknown nature and wilderness within ourselves. This idea appealed to the Beats, who were simultaneously wanderers and visionaries. As they explored more of the American landscape and experimented with psychedelics, they were able to learn more about themselves and, in turn, create more authentic art and writing. We see the influence of the psychedelic experience on Beat writing most clearly with Ken Keezy, who came to prominence in the early 60s after the publication of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Keezy first tried psychedelics as a volunteer in an LSD trial while working in a psychiatric ward. After that experience, he believed psychedelics could transform and liberate society by instigating revolutionary social and political change. Because of this, he aspired to spread psychedelic use by hosting a series of mixed media art parties called acid tests, where he would serve LSD-spiked Kool-Aid for all who were interested, and large-scale performance art would ensue. The Grateful Dead often performed at Keezy's acid tests, as they were also local to the Bay Area. Influenced by the Beats, their music, personality, and culture encouraged Americans to experiment and live freely. Jerry Garcia said in an interview, "I think the Grateful Dead kind of represents the spirit of being able to go out and have an adventure in America at large. Something like hopping railroads, or being on the road like Kerouac." Deadheads began following the Dead on tour across America, living the kind of nomadic lifestyle Kerouac exemplified in On the Road. Keezy and his friends were likely similarly influenced by Kerouac in the summer of 1964 when they boarded a colorful psychedelic bus called Further, with plans to head east to New York City. Further symbolized the destination that could only be reached through psychedelic mind expansion, radical self-expression, and the exploration of vast American landscape. On their journey, the merry pranksters shared the liberation of LSD with anyone who was interested, sowing the seeds of the psychedelic movement from the West Coast to the rest of the country. When Keezy famously stated, "You're either on the bus or off the bus," he aimed to define a generation of people who were turned on to the psychedelic experience as well as the burgeoning hippie movement. Ultimately, further represented the possibility and freedom in life. The pranksters inspired many young nomads who felt called to explore both themselves and the nature of America. Soon after the further bus journey, the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco would become the convergence point for the emerging hippie counterculture. In January 1967, tens of thousands of people went to the Human Being at Golden Gate Park to hear the beats speak and drop acid communally in the natural surroundings. This image of Ginsberg leading the crowd in Heart Sutra chants and Om mantras, with Gary Snyder at his side, would become the symbol of the Beat Generation's transition to the hippie movement. In the moment Timothy Leary proclaimed, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," it was clear the psychedelic revolution had begun. That spring and summer, around 100,000 young bohemians and hippies flocked to San Francisco. Many of them were following bands that would define the San Francisco psychedelic rock sound, such as the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, who lived communally in the Haight. Others came to attend festivals such as Monterey Pop. It was a time of psychedelic liberty, creative expression, hippie fashions, and free love attitudes. Golden Gate Park would become a stronghold of the movement, allowing people to connect with nature, each other, and themselves daily. People learned the value of sharing with community and rejected the cold individualism that prevailed in the 50s. Additionally, many young hippies developed a radical political consciousness and became involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests, the civil rights movement, and the Berkeley free speech movement of the 60s, in part due to Allen Ginsberg's influence as a major figure in the protests of the time. At the end of the Summer of Love, many young people were motivated to leave traditional societal institutions for nature-based, self-sustaining lifestyles. This Back to the Land movement, which saw many people travel to Northern California, Oregon, and Washington in search of intentional living on communes, was of course rooted in Beat Generation values, those of community collaboration and respect for the natural world. Of course, psychedelic experimentation was integral to commune life as people learned to connect spiritually with nature in new ways. Those who were dropping out of society for this simpler way of living found Gary Snyder's nature-based values and writings especially inspiring. There are estimates that around 750,000 people lived in more than 10,000 communes after Haight-Ashbury, fulfilling Kerouac's prophecy of a great rucksack revolution in America. For the past few weeks, I've been driving my van through Northern California to find remnants of the psychedelic movement that happened here. The legacy of the Beats and hippies seems to live on through the West's nature-focused psychedelic culture. In a part of America that largely retains its wilderness feel, connecting with nature can be a profoundly spiritual practice, powerful on its own, but deepened further by plant medicines. In that encounter, I have personally found immense healing. Facing my vulnerabilities amidst the evergreens and redwoods has taught me more than I can describe about living in conjunction with my deepest and truest self. Because of this, I know there is extraordinary value in being able to have the psychedelic experience in nature or the real world, however messy it may be, as opposed to in a sterile medical facility. After all, it was a creative, experimental approach to psychedelic use that created so many artistic and cultural icons and made the psychedelic movement possible in the first place. Today, combining nature and psychedelics spurs people towards nature-based art and music creation, improved mental health and well-being, and even environmental activism. A recent study at the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London showed that psychedelic use not only helps us feel more connected to nature and ourselves as deeply part of nature, but also drives us towards pro-environmental actions. If even science says so, let's abandon set and setting and take a walk amidst the trees. Today, we are challenged with COVID-19. We are unjustly losing many of our loved ones to the coronavirus, just as many people unjustly lost their loved ones to the Vietnam War. We have stepped up in the Black Lives Matter movement, which in many ways parallels the civil rights movement of the 60s. Many people have taken to cross-country journeys and van dwelling in nature during a time of mass unemployment, expressing the influence of the beats still today. Others yet have taken the quiet of lockdown as an opportunity to explore their inner world through psychedelics, just as people did in Haight-Ashbury. We are losing so much, but it is crucial that we continue to seek opportunities for learning and growth. These times of hardship will inevitably alter the course of our society. But even so, I urge us to foster positive change however we can. If there is anything the Beats and hippies taught us, it is that we must step up to support each other and build community. We can and will carry our world through this together. After all, we are ripe for revolution. Join me on the bus. Thank you.